The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide. The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
Since Barack Obama came onto the political scene, there have been questions about his eligibility to hold the office of President of the United States. Those who have raised these questions have been ridiculed as conspiracy theorists. From the beginning, Obama refused to release passport records, all of his school, college, and law school records, and of course the long-form certificate of live birth. In April of 2011, the White House released a file reputed to be the long-form certificate of live birth. This so-called document has been proven to be fraudulent.
The birth certificate document is a forgery.
President Obama has spent millions of taxpayer dollars to keep these records from the American people, who have a right to know who their president is. Demand action. Demand that Obama's records be released. Visit ObamaReleaseYourRecords.com to find out how to get involved. That's ObamaReleaseYourRecords.com. It's time to demand action. Full Contact with Eric Rush live here on a Labor Day. And I'm streaming at you, screaming at you. Hope you're enjoying yourself. I'm here with Montgomery Sibley. We're talking about the Obama administration dismissing, or rather quashing the indictment of Elizabeth Duke, domestic terrorist. And I asked you to hold a thought, which was probably unfair, Montgomery, because I never do that when I'm being interviewed. I straight away forget. You're probably better than I am at that. So, and they say, "Well, where were you before the break?" And I go, "I don't know."
I know exactly where I was.
Excellent. Excellent. Mind like a trap.
Point.
So I did
Here's
have.
the point.
Go on, because I did have a quick question. And I don't.
Ask the question.
Well, I don't want to throw you off of the point, but when we're talking about these magistrate judges, now you said they can be, shall we say, relieved at any time.
True.
Would that provide someone, an unscrupulous someone, perhaps, to try to exert leverage, some sort of influence with regard to how they did their job, as opposed to a federal judge?
Eric, that's a very perceptive question. And remember, the reason Congress in 1789 gave federal judges life tenure was to insulate them from that very sort of thing, that ability to provide influence because they could have their pay diminished or they could lose their job. And so we enshrined in them this very noble obligation to put everything else aside and follow the law wherever it takes you.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, that's exactly. And that's why when the grand jury, which is really the fourth part of government, most people forget that there's executive, the legislative, the judicial, but the people really sit at the grand jury to judge what the government is doing as well as what individuals are doing. And when the grand jury speaks and said, we think there's enough evidence to believe these people are involved in murder and mayhem and bombing and issue a formal indictment, it's not for the executive, the Department of Justice, to lightly just throw that aside and say, well, we're not going to pay attention to the grand jury. That's why the law, and it's very clear, requires that the court approve the dismissal upon a showing of good cause for such a dismissal. And it requires an Article III court, not an Article I magistrate's court.
Gotcha. Okay. So, please continue.
Well, just to finish up at the Supreme Court.
Right.
My concern is the Supreme Court. I wrote all in a letter, by the way, saying your clerk has refused to file a pleading to prevent me from putting in front of you the maladministration of justice, if not the felonious behavior of one of your subordinate judges over whom you have supervisory power. And therefore, you need to direct the clerk to accept my pleadings. And by the way, I have something secret to tell you about this dismissal. something I want to file ex parte, which means I will not let the government know about it, and that it's sealed so that nobody in the public can know what I'm going to say to these 9 Supreme Court justices. I'm telling them I want their ear because I have something to tell them which will reveal to them the extent of the corruption I believe is going on in the Department of Justice with the collusion of certain members of the judiciary. And that's where the case sits at this moment in time. It's Labor Day, the court's closed, the justices are dispersed, but we'll find out the next week or two whether they're going to let me file my pleading or whether they're going to try to bury it so they can avoid having to deal with the situation I'm presenting them, which is they're going to have to act because you just can't allow this kind of thing to go on.
No. I wouldn't ask you to speak to this, but last hour I was talking about the president wanting to go and intervene in Syria because of the alleged chemical weapons attacks, and we've got other folks talking about, or reports being made into certain members of the press, that it was really the rebels who executed this attack, and that somehow there were possibly American intelligence involved in this. And my words to my audience, as well as some of the testimony of these folks, was, this goes beyond the pale of even of anything most people would conceptualize with regard to misfeasance and criminality within the government. And so on this side, you're talking about an extent of, I can't think of anything else to call it, but criminality with regard to certain members of the judiciary that goes beyond the pale of anything that I would expect. And I expect a lot, particularly because, I'm the guy that, even some conservative libertarians laugh at when I tell them things about what this administration would be prepared to do. But I look at what you're talking about vis-a-vis what the judiciary is doing, and it's blowing my mind.
Well, the Founding Fathers had a specific legal term of art for it. They called it high crimes and misdemeanors. And that's a special type of crime that threatens the very existence of the Republic and, of course, is a grounds for impeachment. Grabbing Monica Lewinsky wasn't a high crime and misdemeanor by any stretch of the imagination. Appalling as it is to think about that. It's as bad as the president putting his foot on the presidential desk, for example.
Right.
But it isn't a high crime and misdemeanor. A high crime and misdemeanor threatens the Republic. And when judicial officers are engaging in a conspiracy with executive officers and there's no place to go and complain about it because clerks are preventing the complaint from being received by those who are empowered, and in fact, specifically mentioned by the Constitution to uphold the law, then we have a problem that the Republic's no longer functioning as a republic, it's functioning as an oligarchy.
Well, that is a complaint that I quite frequently make, and that some of my colleagues make. And there's there's a conventional wisdom, among Americans that, of course, all right, you have money, you have power, you have maybe quote unquote undue influence, but this goes beyond that. The very infrastructure and modality, if you will, of how the government works has, if what you're saying is true, and I tend to lean in that direction just for the sake of argument, but it represents a shift beyond anything we've seen in any administration, regardless of whether you liked Bush, didn't like Bush, or Clinton, or Bush, or Reagan, or any of the presidents we've had who have done things that have been, say, questionable. This is a whole different kettle of fish.
I couldn't agree with you more, Eric. I think we have a cancer at the very core of the institutions we initially erected to protect us from the tyranny that we're now beginning to seem to suffer under. So I agree with you.
Where do you go from here with this case? I realize that it's very easy in theory for the Supreme Court to blow you off, as it were, because they get so many, I mean, there are so many filings every year, and they can only look at so many of them, et cetera, but as opposed to them saying they're not going to see you, hear your case because they don't like you or what have you. But where do you go from here with respect to this case?
Well, that's a great question. I have another legal vehicle I will deploy if the clerk again rejects it, because I'll just sue the clerk directly, and that's going to create an issue as to when a clerk can refuse to file a legitimately properly presented pleading. But of course, that just drags things out another 6 to 9 months as that messes around. I will again alert the judiciary committees of the House and the Senate, but they're staffed with staffers who have agendas. They're staffed with or populated by senators and representatives who have their own money-making policy agendas, and they're not really focusing on some of the core issues that I believe are important, which is the whole structure of the federal judiciary, and it's continued drawing back from doing the very core duty it's assigned to, which is protect us from the abuses of government more than anything else. Yeah, absolutely. Will you be able to stay with me through the last break and just into our last segment at the end of the hour? Yeah, I'd like to go visit that first question you asked me. I'd be happy to do that. Okay, yeah, we've got about 30 seconds right now. We can do that, and because I definitely want to get where you're leaving it, and I knew the time, I knew the hour was going to go fast, but that's the way it goes. I definitely wanted to hear where you're going to leave it, and how where you're going to take this, and give my audience. I always like to leave my audience something to think about, something to masticate while between the next show. So thank you very much for being on. I'll get back with you after the break, and I will be back with you, my lovely audience, after the break. Full Contact with Eric Rush live. We are talking with Montgomery Sibley. We'll see you again after the break.
He's nothing but a low-down, double-dealing, backstabbing, larcenous, perverted world. Hanging's too good for him. Burning's too good for him. He should be torn into little bits and pieces and buried alive.
In a recent closed-door, the only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.